super excited to be talking with our guest today about building climate resilience from the ground up. Today's guest has an amazing resume, which she will be getting into, and we are going to get to know more about her background. So, Yoko, I would love if you could tell the audience about your background around climate adaptation and what inspired you to work on disaster risk reduction.
Thanks, Christy, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'm really excited to be here and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So, I have been working on disaster risk reduction and community adaptation programs in countries such as Nepal, Myanmar, and Indonesia. But really, what led me to kind of work in this field was actually my work out of college, where I worked as a TV news reporter and producer. I was born and raised in Japan, so this was in Japan. And it was during this time when, I would be reporting constantly on these once in 100-year events like heat waves, floods, typhoons. And I think at the time, because there wasn't that language around climate change, I hadn't internalized it completely. But I think this was my first exposure and understanding of, wow, climate change is really, exacerbating the frequency and severity of disasters and how they're really affecting people's lives. And during this time also, the 2011 earthquake and tsunami happened in the country. I think some of you may have seen this in the news last month because it marked the 10-year anniversary last March,
Wow.
so last month. But this was the worst, most devastating disaster the country had experienced in recent history. 20,000 people lost their lives. And I think, covering this really made me see how preparedness before a disaster is the difference to life and death. Mm-hmm. And also really, and even in the wealthy country like Japan, how the disaster itself, of course, there's damage to houses and roads. But of course, all of this happens in existing socioeconomic conditions and inequalities. If you are poor or if you are, older and you're 80 and you don't have the physical strength to evacuate, or if you don't have the financial resources to recover, even in a wealthy country like Japan, I really saw how disasters exacerbate the existing socioeconomic conditions of the society. And I think that was when I knew this was something, if I was going to do anything with my life or career, that's what I wanted to do, to work with, people at the front lines being most impacted by disasters. And of course, with climate change, we know things like sea level rise, rising temperatures, more rainfall, there's more flooding and landslides, that you can't really separate climate change from disasters because climate change is exacerbating the severity and frequency.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell the audience about your work with Mercy Corps and what you do there?
Yeah, sure. That's probably what I should have started with.
No, it's great. It's great. Why we're here, but also, your work is incredible and encompasses so many things. But yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so I work as the climate change advisor for the Asia region for Mercy Corps. And my day-to-day work looks like advising countries on their climate change related programming. Countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Timor-Leste, Myanmar, Indonesia. And I really have the privilege to be working with country teams that are supporting communities to build their resilience to events like disasters and climate change. And
yeah.
I just add
no, go ahead.
that Mercy Corps is a nonprofit, because I feel like many people in the audience may have not heard of Mercy Corps before. Mercy Corps is a nonprofit. We are a global team of humanitarians working in around 40 countries, and we really work with communities who are living in poverty, in violent conflict, at high risk of disasters, to build long-term solutions.
Amazing. Thank you for that rundown. Great breakdown of all your work. And, I think it's incredible that you have a background doing reporting and content creation, but you also have this policy background and this development background, which I think, brings all of these elements around storytelling and narrative. And I think the real reason why I was really excited to have you all on my show was about this reframe when we're thinking about vulnerable frontline communities on the ground when it comes to talking about the climate crisis. Because I think a lot of people know that a lot of communities from around the world, especially communities in the global south, are on the front lines of the climate crisis. They are going to be hit first and worst by natural disasters, and already are. And I think a lot of people are aware of that fact, even by watching, the daily news cycle. But I think the issue that I have is the framing around the community. There's always this discussion of like, well, if a disaster hits, a flood, a hurricane, tornado, whatever hits this community, okay, let's raise all these funds, run all these fundraisers. The news cycle is so focused on concentrating resources to make sure that these communities get out of, the worst red zone of a disaster. But then what happens to that community afterwards? What happens in the interim after the disaster before the next disaster hits? And I think that there's not enough discussion about that because a lot of these communities, especially in the global south, are viewed as these quote unquote third world countries who don't have the resources or the education to know how to protect themselves when climate change is impacting their lives. And I really was inspired by Mercy Corps when they approached me to want to be on my show, because they were bringing this different lens, that they're an organization that's trying to flip the script on that, is trying to say, no, these communities are inherently resilient, are inherently full of power and knowledge and resources. How do we tap in and invest in that? Rather than it being, let's come in and let's help these poor, innocent people who don't know any better. And I thought that was really interesting, because when we're thinking about climate change and we're thinking about the communities that are going to be most impacted by these things, we have to also recognize that these people are not just victims. They are living their day-to-day lives. They are having to adapt to the climate crisis, and they already are. So it's just about, how can there be organizations and resources put in that actually supports their well-being and their growth, so they're not forced to have to, be quote unquote victims. And so that's why Mercy Corps really caught my attention, and exactly why I am so stoked to have Yoko on my show today. So, Yoko, building off of what you were just saying about your work in such an amazing region that is specifically vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, I just wanted to know, for people in the audience who may not know, could you break down the term disaster risk reduction and how it relates to the climate crisis?
Sure, thanks, Christy. So disaster risk reduction is really a systematic approach where you identify and assess and reduce risks. And when you think of risks and disasters, it's really important to break that down a little bit too, in that there's components of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. So, imagine if you are living in a house in the middle of a hill that is dangerous from landslides. You are obviously very exposed. You are vulnerable to landslides. And for example, if you're poor and you don't have the resources to be able to build your house back after it gets destroyed, then your capacity to be able to recover is also very limited. Yeah. So disaster risk reduction is really looking at this holistically and systematically, and identifying and assessing and ultimately reducing risks. And I think I might just add, and please stop me if it's too technical, but there's this disaster risk reduction. It's a concept and it's a little bit vague, but there's actually 4 steps in the cycle. So the first one starts with mitigation, where you are minimizing your risk. So this could be something like how you plan your use of land, where you build houses. And then the next step in the cycle is preparedness. How are you preparing to better respond to disasters? Like, having an evacuation plan, knowing what to do when there's an earthquake alert. And then the third step is recovery. The third step is response. So, in the event of a disaster, how are you actually responding?
Yeah.
And the last part is recovery. And this is more long term, because the disaster itself, there will be physical impacts, but it will have, disruptions. And it's a huge shock and stress to the economy and society. And so how are you recovering? And it's really important to see this all as a cycle, because how you recover obviously, reflects on how prepared you are for the next disaster.
No, I mean, I didn't think that was that technical at all. I think that was a really important breakdown. So basically, all four of those steps is really important in order to like actually have a community recover from a disaster. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Could you explain like what is good disaster reduction versus like not as effective disaster reduction?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned when I talked about risk, things like exposure, vulnerability, capacity. So if you think about these things, they're all very context specific, right? So depending on what kind of community you're in, who are the types of people, what are the kinds of groups in your community, that really influences vulnerability and risk. So a good, I think, disaster risk reduction program really spends time understanding the context of the community and understanding the risk of the community, so that then you are, often co-developing actions or solutions that can reduce the risk. Because if you come in with an assumption of, oh, this community is probably vulnerable to A, B, and C, so we need to be doing this, and try to kind of just apply that, you're really missing a learning opportunity to learn what the actual risk is and what you can be doing.
Yeah. Do you feel like the way that a lot of, I mean, I'm just going to state my opinion from what I've observed. Based on what I've seen in the news worldwide, when a lot of these disasters are hitting, it seems like there are on the ground community groups more than maybe there used to be, but it seems like there's still this like very traditional like, let's just like come in and like flood this area with resources and then we're out. But I don't know if you could weigh in any of your viewpoints on that, on like, yeah, I loved what you said about capacity and context and all those things. And I just don't know if like right now the way that aid is distributed worldwide during disaster is really reflecting that. But maybe I'm wrong. Would love to know your thoughts.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Traditional disaster risk reduction programs, or even response, they focused on, when you think of the cycle parts, like preparedness and response. And of course, this is due to the kind of attention it gets. If there's a huge disaster, as you said, it's in the media, there's more public interest. So there's this tendency to focus on preparedness and response. But if you think about what I just mentioned as the cycle for disaster risk reduction, those are just, two parts. And you really need to address, especially the economic losses of the communities, which are key to their ability to recover or build back better. So I think what we are trying to do is to kind of grow from just traditional disaster risk reduction approaches and work on the recovery and the long-term resilience building. And what this means in practice is really equipping communities with the knowledge and skills and resources to be able to build their own resilience, leveraging the, often the amazing knowledge that they also have.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm so excited for you to delve more into how that all works. And I think that that's exactly the issue. Like, with this whole reframe of needing to reframe like how aid is distributed when it comes to a community, it requires actually understanding how to distribute those resources. Even when we're thinking about planting trees, you have to know the context in which that tree is going to be planted, where it's going to grow, how it's going to impact that local community. Like, every quote unquote solution to addressing climate change needs to have cultural nuance, needs to have context. And that includes disaster risk reduction. So I'm really happy that we're starting to talk about that. So speaking of context, We specifically want to center in on the case study that I made in partnership with Mercy Corps, specifically talking about your work in Nepal. And, Nepal is probably known by many people, even in the audience, on a baseline level as a vulnerable community or vulnerable country is probably how it's framed. But I would love to know from your own perspective, since you've done such deep, engaged work there and you're talking all about the importance of context, could you explain how you've collaborated with communities in Nepal, what's happening there in regards to climate change, all of that stuff?
Yeah, sure. So to start off with some background on the country, it's a tremendously diverse country in terms of ethnicities, but also geography. There's over 120 ethnic groups in the country, and the geography is also extremely diverse, ranging from tropical climates all the way to alpine. So I think many of us have, know of Mount Everest. So you have the Himalayas and Mount Everest in the north. And in the middle, you have this hilly region where the capital, Kathmandu, is located. And in the south, bordering India, you have the plains. And this is a country where 2/3 of the population work in the agriculture sector. And the sector contributes to around 30% of the GDP. Globally, we know 3 out of 4 people living in poverty are dependent on natural resources and agriculture to survive. So you can imagine, climate change, like more rainfall, more disasters, how this really impacts a country, and why Nepal is known as being vulnerable is because the majority of the population work in the agriculture sector, and they are very dependent on weather variants and are vulnerable to extreme weather events.
Thank you for providing that context. So in terms of that vulnerability, what happens to these communities? What could happen if a disaster strikes and they don't have maybe those mitigation practices in place or that preparedness? What has happened in the past, or things that you've observed?
Yeah, so in the communities that we work with, a lot of them are smallholder farmers, or they're subsistence farmers. So they provide, their own food. So if you have something like a flood or a landslide that destroys all of their livestock, all of their crops, they don't really have alternative places to live or alternative, work to do, because they've lost their land and it's inundated. So we've seen, communities being displaced, people having to go migrate and find work in India, where the communities border, and really disrupting their livelihoods and also their connection to, the land and that they've grown up in. And I think another important issue is food shortages. So when you have an agriculture reliant economy and many people's livelihoods depend on this, when a disaster happens and wipes out all of their crop, this leads to food shortages and what we call negative coping mechanisms, people having to sell their assets to be able to buy food.
Wow. I've never heard that term before, negative coping mechanisms. That's interesting. I mean, that must have a lot of psychological impacts too, when you're ripped away from your livelihood, your community. It's devastating. And I mean, in addition to that, when we're talking about the term climate refugee, which obviously is a very charged term on an international level, again, there's this narrative of oh, well, why did they have to leave their country, or why did they have to leave their land? And it's if your land is not profitable or you can't survive off of it anymore, people are going to be left with no choice. And so as climate change continues to threaten communities with floods, drought, etc., there needs to be a discussion on how to actually work with these communities so that way they are able to avoid that well before it happens. So I think it's really important what you brought up. So diving into these preventative measures, I wanted you to talk about the actual methodology. How does Mercy Corps actually address this like really big systemic issue on the ground in Nepal? And this may take a little bit of time to break down because it is a little complicated. So take your time explaining each part of it. But would love to learn from this case study, like how did you all go into Nepal, build relationships with the community on the ground, and actually like start building out a framework on how to build resilience with the resources and the community that was there.
Yeah, so we have been working in a program called what we call the Managing Risk Through Economic Development program. We started in 2013, so it's been nearly 10 years since we started. And we work with smallholder farmers in the far west region of the countries. The communities we work with are marginalized groups and ethnic minorities. And a study at the beginning of the program showed that around half lived under the poverty line. And in this program, we also have a strong focus on women because we know women are more impacted by disasters and climate change because they have less economic, social, and political power than men and are less able to cope with the impacts. And, as we've been discussing, these communities face challenges like homes and roads being destroyed, their agriculture products being wiped out in disasters. So we, supported them with an approach that combines disaster risk reduction with market systems development.
Can you explain what market
Yeah.
systems development is?
Yeah. What this means is we help farmers develop agricultural commodities, so crops that have economic growth and income generating potential while also supporting disaster risk reduction. So what this looked like in practice is we worked with the government agriculture department, private sector actors, and community members to identify crops and interventions that could contribute to disaster risk reduction, but also generate income. And for example, we identified sugarcane as one crop that we could plant on erosion-prone and flood-prone riverbanks to, prevent erosion and prevent flooding, but also use marginal lands, land that people were not using, that people did not think were capable of being used for plantation, so that we, by supporting the communities with techniques to plant sugarcane on this land, we, helped set up a kind of system where the sugarcane can be sold for income and contribute to their economic development, but also protect riverbanks during flooding and protect community assets and infrastructure.
Did you work with like scientists to identify where that sugarcane could be grown? Like how did you like identify because it's these people didn't think that this land could actually be, generative. How did you figure that out?
Yeah, so of course we worked with technical experts, and we also did a lot of context analysis to interview government officials, community members, private sector actors, looked at practices from nearby areas to see, what could be the potential, and the amount of assessments and analysis that went in before was really important. But I think in reality, a lot of times you don't have like the community level climate hazard modeling, for example, of like this tiny remote community in Nepal. So I think, we need to work with existing resources and to build trust and find experts in the communities that understand their community and know the changes, even if they're not articulating it in like climate change science language. And really, build on their knowledge and, gain their trust, build relationships, and we came to a point where we were piloting these interventions to see if it worked, because this was kind of a hypothesis going in, right? After research, like maybe the sugarcane could support disaster risk reduction and also, grow in this area. But as I mentioned, this had never happened before. So a lot of people are like, oh no, like this sugarcane's not going to grow. But when we started, we saw that it did grow and that it was actually, supporting communities. And I could share one story of a woman farmer, Sarita. She basically was displaced from her community because of a flood event that basically killed all her livestock and destroyed all
Wow.
of her land. And her family just could not live there anymore, or her community, and they were all displaced. But she, you know, participated in our work in promoting sugarcane plantation, learned agriculture techniques and ways to, plant the sugarcane. And to kind of everyone's surprise, I guess, the sugarcane, grew and ended up providing income. And now the community, her family and her community were able to reclaim 40 hectares of
Wow.
land and also move back to their ancestral lands.
Wow. That's so cool. That's amazing. Wow. Okay, so for people who may be listening to this, just to reiterate it, so basically this system is you all had this hypothesis to figure out which crop could grow on, this otherwise eroded land that was not being used otherwise. How, for that part of it, to get access to that land, to use that land, like, how did you get permission to do that? Or did you just, like, go in? Like, what did that look like? Because I know there's this, like, other, like, government and private sector, civil society part of the whole thing. So if you could explain that too.
Yeah, so we, of course, worked a lot with the local governments and the existing governance, what we say as governance structures of the area, like community organizations, community groups, because we don't want to go in and, unknowingly harm the community by not recognizing certain aspects that we were not aware of. So
Yeah.
we definitely worked with the governments and communities to identify and assess the risk, but also understand what is the right approach to go about it. And I think, some of this work on like sugarcane plantation, agriculture, these are all kind of more technical components. But I think it's really important to emphasize kind of more of the trust and relationship building aspect of the process. Because, I mean, if you imagine in your own community, and you're struggling with flooding, someone comes and tells you, like, you should plant sugar cane. Like, we know it's really good and it'll work, so you should do it. Like, and you have no idea who this person is. You don't have a relationship with them. You don't trust them. Like, are you going to do it? No, right? I think it's some of it is kind of, if you think about it in your own shoes, it makes sense. You need to have the trust and relationship in the process and make sure that everyone is okay with it, people understand it, and people are willing to work on it with you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like, let's stop the colonizer vibes. Like, we don't need people to come in and, like, save people. Like, we need people who are going to be allies and collaborators and actually understand the context of what this community is going on in this community on the ground, and, like, actually, like, being supportive of what they've already done and the leadership that they hold. I think that that's really amazing that you all have acted in such a respectful and considerate way in order to, like, actually make this sustainable in the long term. So yeah, I mean, I love the story that you just shared. I want to know, like, what other benefits did you see once this hypothesis actually proved true for these communities in Nepal?
Yeah, so touching a little bit on the process part, I think it's also important to highlight that this is also a learning journey. And even with intensive context analysis and engagement, for example, in the beginning of the program, that we saw that women were not participating in community structures of disaster risk reduction. Even though they were present in the room, they were not engaging, voicing their thoughts and opinions. And after recognizing this, we did some more further, interviews, context analysis, and understood that, a lot of it had to do with the social household dynamics. And we added into our program negotiation training for women, and also things like household dialogues on disaster risks, and also financial literacy. And also for, agriculture techniques, we supported women farmers specifically for some of the climate smart agriculture techniques and equipped them with approaches on how they could be adapting more to climate change and extreme weather events. And I think I can think of an example of a woman farmer, Babita, who participated in our program and learned about the different types of crops and their resistance to weather events like drought. And after receiving our training, she converted her paddy to bananas during the dry season and, saw that it was successful. And I think when I mentioned financial literacy training earlier, many of you may have thought, so what does financial literacy training have to do with disaster risk reduction? But if you want to scale the success of your business, of your farm, you need investment, right? You need financial resources. So through the financial literacy training we provided to her, she was able, and the facilitation to access to microfinance institutions, she was able to take out a loan and invest in her farm to be able to scale it. And she's really, she's now earning, of course, a profit, and really also serves as a role model for her community. And because we have, done training and we put emphasis on skills and knowledge building for the communities, then she will be able to, transfer the knowledge to her other community members or even people outside of her community.
I mean, it doesn't need to be like really said, but I just love it in your own words. Like, why do you think a program like this is valuable when addressing the climate crisis? Like, why is it important that communities on the ground need to be empowered to recognize their own resilience?
Yeah, so I think the climate change is really a daunting challenge, and sometimes it's kind of hard to conceptualize it. What does it mean in practice to actually support people? But I think there's a lot of knowledge and skills that are out there that, because of existing socioeconomic conditions or information gaps, because of these inequities, people don't have access to them all the time. And it's an access problem. It's sometimes an availability problem, but it's also an access problem. And then also a participation problem. Like, even if you know about it and you can access it, can you actually engage? So I think our role coming in is to be able to, be the kind of a partner and a facilitator to make sure that resources are available and that communities can access them and also meaningfully engage.
Yeah, no, I thank you for sharing that. And, I love the story about empowering women, specifically incorporating that into your context analysis. I love that phrase, context analysis. I need to add that to my vocabulary. But yeah, I'm wondering, like, did you see, outside of, even the women, did you see this like generate more jobs? Did people actually understand more about climate change in the community after you implemented these things? Like, what were some of the things that you saw in addition to, women empowerment?
Yeah, so practically speaking, sugarcane income increased by over 500% in these communities. Yeah, so a really big impact.
500%, that's so much. Wow. Okay.
And after a major flood event, we did an assessment, and we found that communities who had participated in our program felt more confident in their ability to respond to disasters, and they didn't need to migrate to other, or go to other places to find work, which shows that there was some system in place to keep the economy going.
That's so cool. I nerd out about stuff like this on this show. I'm like, this is a climate solution. I love it. Yeah, I'm just wondering, yeah, I mean, you've kind of touched on some of these other questions I had about why it's valuable, but I'm interested in your perspective on this reframe too. I mean, obviously you've kind of touched on it, but what's the role of organizations? Like, it seems like Mercy Corps kind of like went out there and did this hypothesis. You even said that like it hadn't really been done before. Like, like, do you feel the work that you all are doing is changing the conversation around how people are thinking about development, period, like around these kinds of this kind of form of long-term aid? Like, I'm just wondering, like, where do you see Mercy Corps' role in like that conversation?
Yeah, so at Mercy Corps, we are really, intent on supporting community resilience in the long term. And I think a lot of it is, sharing our experience, like I guess what I'm doing now, with the general public, but also peer organizations, countries that fund these types of programs, private sector actors that fund these types of initiatives, to say, these are the kinds of approaches that can actually be strengthening climate resilience in the long term. It's
Yeah.
not, just one drop type of, you just do it and you're out, but it's something that you have to work on together as a partner. And I think that, we do take emphasis on really creating a lot of knowledge products out of this to be able to inform people about what are the good practices that are happening and what is the kind of good impact we're seeing, and how can we be scaling this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one interesting part about the MRED program is, because of the positive impact it had on economic development and also disaster risk reduction, around 20 communities outside of our targeted areas adopted some of the approaches.
Wow.
So this is, I guess, replication, and local governments have invested their own budgets in some of the activities that we did in the program. So I
Wow.
think it's really important to be engaging with different actors to be able to update them on the process. And this also leads to trust building, but also to be able to support them on, if you want to do it on your own, like, what do you need to do? And this, I think, is the key for a longer term resilience.
Yeah, it seems like there needs to be a combination of actors from different sectors, because you're working with like on the ground community with like indigenous, like local knowledge. You're working with the private sector, you're working with government, you're working with like all three of those categories, which are very different, and typically they might even like go head to head in some situations. So it's interesting, like how do you all feel like you were able to negotiate this as like a win-win-win for everyone? It just seems like it was like whoosh, I don't know, like a great explosion of solutions. But I'm just wondering, like, yeah, it's just so brilliant. I just want to learn more. How did you come up with this? Like, where did this? And how did you propose it? I'm interested in like how you proposed it and really like got more people on board.
I think, one characteristic of Mercy Corps that we take pride in is that 85% of our team are from the countries that we work in. I think this is really important, especially when you're doing community work, because, as much as I am aware, to the extent that I can, recognize the knowledge gaps that I may have for the community, obviously, if you have a team member that is from the same ethnic group, that is from the same area, that makes it totally big, it's a huge difference.
Yeah.
So I think, having diverse voices in the room is important anywhere, but it's also important for your own team too. So you have people with different backgrounds, different, areas of expertise, and make sure that you're really leveraging the resources of your team members to conduct good work.
Yeah. Yeah, so it sounds like you all like already had the benefit of not needing to like go in somewhere and be like, okay, here's a solution. It's like, oh, they identified that like these are the gaps, like let's experiment and figure out like how we can work with the knowledge and the resources we already have. That's really cool. So in addition to like trust and relationship building, as well as having diversity on your team, is there any other aspects that you think are really valuable to be able to successfully do this kind of like community resilience work? Like any other tools or talents you think people should cultivate?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important, even when you have a successful case and you have a successful approach that works in one area, to keep in mind that one solution does not fit all. I mean, this is for anything, but also for community disaster risk reduction work. I mean, if you think about Nepal, it's over 120 ethnic groups. Even communities in the same region could have different social dynamics, different ways of engagement, different power structures. I think this is the same in any country, really. But to keep in mind that even when you have a model or approach that has been successful, when you are applying it to other areas, you need to really have this kind of learning mindset and know that just because it worked in one community will not work in another, and to make sure that you're not, kind of bandaging solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's at the core of it. Like we can't have band-aid solutions. Of course, that can help out things in the short term, but if you're going to actually like systemically change the way that a community lives, it requires like really long, arduous relationship building, which is messy. It's not just this like one size fits all thing that you can, put in a report and say, okay, this is how we solve this when things are constantly changing. And I'm sure even the MRED program is going to continue to need to adapt as things change too. So,
Yeah. And I think one important point is that we basically have the next 2 years of the program, the next few years of the program, to invest in making sure that the systems and that we've built are sustainable
yeah.
after we are gone. Because it's great if the program's working when we're here, but after we're gone and everything stops, like that's not our intention, and that does not lead to longer term resilience. So I
Right.
think, in addition to, making sure that we're working with existing systems and governance structures, I think a unique part of the program is that we've invested in time, with a goal specifically to make sure that the systems that we've worked with remain in place. And what this means often when we're doing community programming is that the community is, of course, in a broader environment, right, with like different policies, with different private sector actors, just a broader environment. And I think what's important is to make sure that we are connecting the community with existing resources, and to make sure that that we don't need to be there to facilitate everything. That even after we're finished with the program, the activities will continue without our coordination and facilitation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really important. It's definitely like you are kind of the glue right now of holding together this kind of system. So it is really going to be important to figure out like who's going to fill like those positions of leadership and how to sustain that intergenerational education on this kind of system. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah. If anyone has any other questions, you can put them in the chat. I do have a few more questions myself, but please stick some questions in the ask a question box or in the chat if you have questions for Yoko. I am interested like with with like the actors on the ground, like with the government, like was there any form of like resistance or any form of like people questioning what you all were doing? I know you were saying that there's people questioning you about like growing the sugar cane, but was there other like conflict or anything like that? Because it does sound like it kind of was just like everyone held hands and it was like a merry process, and maybe that is what happened, but I want to know like from your perspective, were there any barriers in this work? Because I'm sure people in the audience may be thinking about their own community and what kind of bureaucracy they have to go through, so I'm wondering how you all navigated that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, of course, this is a really key part of relationship building. And even if you imagine yourself, building relations as part of your, with the community or with the government, in your own area, like entails a lot of time and conversations and trust building. And sometimes it can be in practice really just, showing up and being available when they need certain advice on things, or if they need certain advice on policy measures, being able to support them with our expertise and the things that we bring to the table, and to be able to be a good partner to the government, I think is really important. And it's not like we, came in with like a great idea and statistic and presented it and they were amazed and they said, yes, it's a process, right? You
Yeah.
can't, especially, and I think it's applicable to any place really. Like you
Yeah.
have to like invest in building relationships. And that often starts with just knocking at the door and having a conversation,
Yeah.
learning about them. Like, what are your challenges? Like, what are you struggling
Mm.
with? Like, what is the kind of support you need, or what's working well that you really want to do more of?
Mm. No, that's such good advice. Someone asked if you were to start a new, this builds off of what you were just saying. If you were to start a new climate resilience program in another country, or a disaster risk reduction in this context, what lessons would you take from your experience in Nepal?
I think there are, I would say, maybe three main lessons. I know I've kind of said them before, but to repeat, to make sure there's a range of diverse voices when you are designing the work, and this difference between having different people present to having different people actually participating and engaging. So like in numbers, you could be like, oh, we have like all representation from all of these groups. But if it's only the dominant group speaking in any of these meetings, that's not meaningful participation. So to make sure that the range of diverse voices are actually represented, this is the first point. I think the second point is to don't come in with assumed solutions. I think we are a partner. We are also here to learn, and we want to learn from the community, and they already have a lot of knowledge. And to don't come in thinking you know more, or thinking that this is the way you should solve a problem. To really be a partner and learn. And then the last point, I would say, is to center solutions around the people that are most impacted.
Mm. Love that. On that note, I would love for you to tell the audience more about where they can learn about MRED and Mercy Corps and all of this awesome work you just laid out in this beautiful 1 hour discussion.
Yeah. So I know, Christy, you'll send out like a resource guide after this show. So please do, if you're interested, take time to read through those. Our website, mercycorps.org, you can access it. There's a category on climate that will have program examples in addition to the MRED program we talked about. We're on social media. Mercy Corps is MERCYCORPS. So you can follow us. We do highlight a lot of stories from the countries that we work in. So I think that might be a good place to kind of learn more about our work.
Amazing. And my very, very last question, because this hour zoomed by somehow, some way. There's always a lot of young people on here, especially young Black, Indigenous, and people of color who watch my show and may want to get into the environmental field, and they probably think your work is really cool. I know I think your work is really cool. Just want to know if you have any advice for people doing this work, whether that be like what gives you hope, any tips on things that they can focus on if maybe they want to get into this field. Would love if you could finish off with some of your reflecting thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think I really want to thank everyone who's here, because learning and knowledge is really important. And a big challenge like climate change, it is really daunting, and I find it quite daunting as well. But really, the only world we live in is one we work on solutions together. And we need to be speaking up and standing up and showing up and you're already showing up, to educate yourself more about these issues, which I think is really the first step. And, just even sharing this with your friends and family, it's really important because change always starts with one person. So I think, I'd like to really say that you are already doing the work by educating yourself. And I'm really excited that all of them, we had some participants today. So I think to continue to learn and find opportunities of where you can contribute. It doesn't have to be at a global scale in Nepal. Like, climate change is surely impacting the community you live in right now. So if you could take away some of the lessons we talked about, and start learning more about your community, and think of as I mentioned, a lot of it is about building relationship and trust, and this is about having conversations with human beings, right? And you can start that if you want to kind of start your journey in contributing to climate resilience for your communities.
Oh, I love that so much. You have been such an excellent guest today. You have educated me so much and so many of the folks in my audience. Again, this is the folks from Mercy Corps who I collaborated with for Earth Month to talk about climate change and climate resilience. You can read the Instagram post that we collaborated on and created awesome resource talking all about the MRED program. I will link the resources in the show notes talking about MRED and Mercy Corps, so please check out their work. And thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Brown Girl Green, where I interview environmental leaders and advocates about justice, diversity, and inclusion, as well as creative solutions to the climate crisis. I'll catch you all next time. Thank you so much, Yoko.
Thanks, Christy. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Bye, everyone.